Every year we're told what foods and flavors will define what we will be eating, what will be on our plates, what will be in the grocery stores, or even in the restaurants. But where do these trends come from? And do they really matter? I'm Marianne Smith Edge, and today we're going to talk about a topic that's always top of mind, especially at the beginning of every year: food trends. Today, I have an expert that will be able to help unpack some of those questions. My guest is Mindy Hermann, a New York-based registered dietitian and food trend expert that actually spends time on analyzing and summarizing the food trends and how they impact not only the consumer, but especially food service and restaurants. Welcome, Mindy. It's great to have you, and I think the fact is, maybe the first question is, and I'm always, even though I've followed the food trends, look at consumer trends, I'm always intrigued, where do food trends really come from?
Thanks, Marianne, and good luck with your new podcast. I'm very pleased to claim my space as your first guest. So it's January, and we're definitely in food trend season. And food trend predictors are everywhere. So you can hear them on podcasts. You can read about them in the newspaper. It's almost like a day doesn't go by without somebody predicting trends. So where did all this start? It might be as early as Adam, Eve, and the apple. So you think, apples, well, that's a new fruit. Let's see if others will find them appealing, and hence the first food trend. But seriously, food trends have been around for a long time, probably as long as people have been trying to inspire others to eat more of something. So who creates food trends? Why do they do it? Sometimes the predictors of food trends are retailers like Whole Foods or Kroger, who want to excite consumers about what's in the store and inspire them to try new things and inspire them to come into the store to try something new. So Whole Foods is a really good example, and every year they come up with a set of trends predictions. So their press release for their 2026 trends says, enjoy your first bites, sips, and samples of the new year. So there, it's the enticement to come into the store to see what the food trends look like. So there's another trend company that I follow pretty closely. It's called Datassential, and they're based in Chicago. They offer trends for the restaurant industry. And Datassential, they've created a lot of different tracking tools, but they track foods on restaurant menus. And then they say, like, what's hot, which foods are emerging, and what foods and trends might be coming next. So they're really valuable, especially to the restaurant industry, because they can inspire restaurants to create new dishes for their menus. They can run limited time specials, or LTOs, like pumpkin spice drinks. They can check out what the competition is doing, or they can create a buzz around a new dish. Marianne, in your travels, have you seen any new trends in restaurants?
Well, I think you always see some of the trends in new restaurants is, again, that emphasis on protein. I do think over the years we've seen more options in traditional restaurants that are introducing legumes or lentils, which even though are old, they've kind of come back into the trends.
Great. And you just named, two trends that are kind of universal, restaurants and the food supply, and that is protein and then also legumes. So much of my work is spent as a consultant for Innova Market Insights. They're based in the Netherlands. They have a U.S. office in Chicago. And every year, Innova comes out with several sets of trends based on its tracking of new product launches, consumer surveys, and other forces around the world. So, for example, the current unrest in the world, economic pressures, travel. So the biggest report that Innova does is its top 10 trends for food and beverage products for the new year, and they've been doing them for years and years and years. And then Innova also offers insights on consumer trends, flavor trends, packaging trends, and all sorts of other trends. I don't know if there are folks that you like to follow and trends watchers that you check in with kind of on an annual basis.
You mentioned Whole Foods, and of course they're usually the first one out of the gate because they always have trends for the following year, usually in the fall, and then I'll look at Innova and a variety. All you have to do is put in trends into a Google search, and of course you have a dozen or more that look at them. Food Navigator, and it's interesting sometimes to compare when you look at, and I know your work does, is, okay, what are they saying is in the EU versus what's in the US? And I'm kind of curious. I always think a lot of times some of the trends, or especially you and I know from nutrition science, is that I always say it starts across the pond and comes into the U.S. Do you ever see that type of movement on trends, that sometimes perhaps what we say is trending in the U.S. actually has been trending somewhere else previously?
Oh, absolutely. And especially with travel and social media and how connected we all are, it's really easy for something to start in another country or another region and then come over to the US. A lot of times when people travel, or even, as simply as they're going to restaurants in their own country, when they see trends, then they say, hey, I'd like to do that at home. I'd like to see that in my local restaurants. One of the big trends in the US right now is GLP-1 drugs. And it's clearly a US phenomenon, but it's having huge impact on food trends. And I think we can expect, as the medications are approved in other countries, that they may start seeing the same impact on food trends that we are here in the United States.
Well, you mentioned GLP-1s, and everybody has heard that, and we probably know that there's probably more people on them even that we know personally than what we realize. When we talk about the impact, unpack that a little bit for me to talk a little bit more. Of course, protein is key in that, but where do you see that movement go? And especially, not that we're talking about GLPs necessarily in this, but that is a definite introduction into the health world that is impacted trends. And now that it's also in pill form, there's probably going to be an increase in the number of users. So where do you see that taking the food industry, restaurants, et cetera, in the coming year or so?
That's a great question. And it's an example of how something that is not a food can really impact food trends. So I don't know where to start. Okay, so first of all, protein, because it's super important for people to be eating a high protein diet, to help maintain muscle mass. Smaller portions. People just they're not eating as much. So it's going to impact packaged foods, because portions, I don't know, when I go to the store, I look at portion sizes, and a lot of times I think that it's just too small. But now people who do packaged foods are going to find that maybe the portion size they've been serving is right size for folks on GLP-1 drugs. There's been a move to health. So all of a sudden, people who were snacking on tortilla chips and candy and other types of snacks aren't finding them appealing anymore. They're looking for things that are more healthful. So it's a whole change in mindset. And that is going to change, I think, what prepared foods look like in the grocery store, what things look like in restaurants, and also the products that people are buying. And there may be like whole product lines that lose popularity, at least with the people who are on GLP-1 drugs. And I think a lot of times when we talk about trends, the trends impact that top 5% of consumers. But then if you dig down deeper, sometimes the trends aren't even relevant to folks who are more income insecure, food insecure, who live in food deserts. A lot of the trend stuff may seem just fluffy.
Well, two comments on that is that what I really, I think this particular trend of when you mention smaller portions, even though all aren't going to be on the GLP-1 drugs, ultimately it could help all of us, because we know that you and I probably complain at times the size of portions in restaurants. Others would say, well, that's not enough. But again, if we right size portions, it could be beneficial for all of us. And, I think to your point about do trends really affect all or only the first 5%? And I'm always, when I read that with that lens, because when it says, oh, the flavor of the year, and I noticed for 2026 the flavor of the year, black currant. The fact is, for some that'll be a really hot topic. Others, it's not about a flavor or a trend. It's about, do I have access to food and can I afford it? So, just maybe a little added insight or your thoughts on, do trends, even though we talk about trends and what's on the grocery store, at the end of the day, obviously affects business and food business and what groceries do stock. But how does that impact the population as a whole?
Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. And I think one of the most important things with looking at trends is you have to kind of step back from that, the need to do an annual trend, and look big picture. Like, what's driving these trends that we're seeing? So definitely the focus on protein is huge. It will be huge. Protein's expensive. So there's going to be a need for trendy protein foods at an appropriate cost point, and also that are convenient and accessible. So you can take this big trend protein and say, okay, what do we do with this? If you look at portion size, one of the big issues is this balance between portion size and value. And for somebody who's food insecure or income insecure, they're going to be looking for good value for the money. So to go into the corner restaurant and all of a sudden the portion sizes are half the size, but the price is the same, a person may say, well, this isn't good value for me. Hence, I'm going to go to my favorite fast food place where I can get a value meal. And then nutrition trends don't really matter. It's what can fill them up for the money that they have.
That's always, I think, an issue in that regard, is what we might know as portions is what people perceive as what is really fulfilling. So I think that remains to be seen. Let's change a little bit, because I mentioned black currant, and I went back through some that was McCormick has said that's the flavor of the year. And then I went back to some blogs I have written over the last few years. And for example, a couple years ago, kelp was going to, in the seaweed vegetables, that was the future in that regard. And then a couple years ago, talking about companies definitely going back to some of the traditional grains, from oats and barley. And then we know quinoa has come into play as being very popular in that regard. What's your thoughts on some of these? And I just mentioned, of course, we know global flavors have continued to kind of be a hot over the last several years. But looking back on some of those specific things, and maybe you've identified a few too, when they said 2 or 3 years ago this is going to be hot. Is that still trending, or it was kind of a flash in the pan?
It's probably it's a combination of the two. And I'm chuckling when you're talking about black currant, because sometimes, like, if the flavor of the year was, say, pumpkin spice, my favorite flavor to bash on, it's pretty accessible for people, so they can feel like they're part of the trend. Black currants are delicious. They are really, really nutritious. They're really functional foods. But have you ever seen a black currant in the grocery store? And I can guarantee you, if you did, they'd be really expensive. So then you get into so the flavor of black currant, but the issue is we're moving away from, at least the trends are trying to move away from foods that are more highly processed and move toward foods in their whole food state. So, black currants are kind of fun. Will it take off? Who knows? So, but you asked me a question about some of the things we talked about. So let's look at some of these, like kelp and sea vegetables. They were predicted to be hot a few years ago. They're creeping in more than the average consumer might know. So one force is the diversification of Asian cuisines. They use sea vegetables. They have seaweed salads, and sushi is wrapped in sea vegetables. But what people might not know is that sea vegetables are also a source of omega-3s. So fish sourcing of omega-3s has contributed to drops in a lot of fish populations. So if you think about omega-3s now coming from sea vegetables, you address the sustainability issue with seafood. But the other is for people who don't want to eat animal products or who advocate for preservation of animal populations, now they can get their omega-3s in a form that is more sustainable. Now, looking at grains, it's true, traditional grains are more visible. I love going, I don't know if you do this, go to the Bob's Red Mill display, because they have ancient grains, they have all sorts of flours, and they're really, really fun to play with and fun to look at. But they face I think they face challenges. One is cultivation on large scale. Another is cost, because they are more expensive. Flavor can be an issue for some people because they are more strongly flavored. And versatility is another issue. But then you can look at quinoa, for example, which is just, taken off like wildfire over the past, I don't know, what would you say, 10 years maybe for quinoa?
Yes, I was in Peru in 2016, and for a food conference, and you might have been there, but that was one of the things when we went out to one of the towns outside and was looking at some of the plants, the quinoa plants, and the impact, and kind of moved to the impact back to some of these trends. How does that impact? From the agriculture standpoint, and suddenly it had become very popular in Peru, but it had also increased the price to the fact that the population in Peru suddenly was having a hard time even purchasing one because they were exporting, but the cost had gone up. So I think that's another side effect sometimes when we pick up some of these, as you're saying, we'll call them ancient grains or grains that had not been used, or so to speak. Suddenly it becomes, it's great, and you're right, it suddenly sits on my shelf, but then it has some implications from the growing side as well.
Sure. And I would imagine in Peru, it's created some income disparities, probably with the bigger quinoa farmers now being, quite well off economically, while others are not, plus shortages, plus high pricing, everything that you talked about. And we can look today, let's look last year. How about acai and stores that sell acai bowls? Well, that's a berry or superfruit from Brazil. I'm going to be in Brazil in a couple of weeks, and I'm really looking forward to talking to folks about what's going on with acai, because I would imagine it's a similar story. And then we can look at one of this year's big flavors, which is ube. It's a purple yam from the Philippines. And there too, it's a finite marketplace. And so is all of this demand for ube, how is it affecting the Filipino population, where ube is part of their traditional food culture?
And just a little background, because I had looked at that, and I did a little background, and it very similar to some of the incidents we talked about with quinoa, was the fact that the whole supply and demand is that the demand is not what the supply can keep up with, and so again, that can definitely become an issue in that particular area. I know we're getting time kind of wrapped up, but one of the things I did go back and look at one of those blogs, and you had given me a quote back in 2022 that it's kind of like, oh, the crystal ball. Did Mindy really have the crystal ball? And in some aspects, I think so, because you had mentioned in that quote that you felt like that there would be perhaps a decline in the acceptance or consumption of plant based and not natural plant, but basically plant animal protein substitutes in that regard. So I would be curious where, if you think your crystal ball in 22 actually still is still on target when we look at 2026.
It's funny that you kept that. But anyway, I think it is. And, I was correct and I wasn't correct. So, yes, plant-based meat alternatives have contracted. That was obvious because too many people jumped in really quickly with big investments. There just aren't enough people who are going to buy those products to have it make sense to have like 6 competitors for plant-based ground beef. So the other headwinds they're called plant-based, but when you look at them, a lot of them don't have you don't see plants. So there's a brand of patty, I don't know if it's still around, called Dr. Prager's. I don't know if you've ever had them. But if you cut open a Dr. Prager's patty, at least the ones that I used to eat, you could see the vegetables. So there's an easy connection with, yes, this is plant-based. But for a lot of the plant-based alternatives, it's hard to look at them and feel that they're plant. There are too many of them. And Marianne, you know from your work at IFIC also that consumers buy first on taste and then on price. So these plant-based alternatives are more expensive than animal products. And also they often don't deliver the same taste sensation that you get with an animal product. So I think a lot of people tried them once and said, yeah, no more for me. A lot of them are made from soy. And here in the US in particular, there's some undeserved anti-soy sentiment. So people are not looking to increase soy products. They're nibbling at the edges, as I call it, are some mycoprotein products. And I don't know if you're familiar with the brand Quorn, Quorn. It's in the UK, and it was the only brand globally that used mycoprotein or a mushroom type protein. But that's become popularized now. And so I think you're going to see a lot more plant-based alternatives that are made with mycoprotein, from steaks to fish fillets to jerky, to all sorts of different products. So I would say, and then, the last is plant-based dairy, which I think I also talked about. And I'm waiting to see that decline. Again, like with meat, too many options, too expensive. And with thankfully an increased focus on nutrition, they just don't stack up to milk, and milk is making a comeback. So dairy milk. So I would say I was 50% correct on the prediction.
Well, I think for most predictions, that's pretty good. And to your point about the return of dairy, my personal bias is very being that I grew up on a dairy farm. That's always a good thing. But the key to really to be able to offer that same nutrition package in a milk-based product is important. And I would say probably with the announcement of the dietary guidelines for Americans last week, again, a higher presence or emphasis on return of animal proteins, that will probably always be, we'll probably see some definitely increase in consumption in that particular area. So
I think you're absolutely right.
So quick question is that we talk about trends and how does it influence, even though you spend hours analyzing trends, do any of the trends actually affect what is on your plate?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, if it's Dubai chocolate, it does, because I think Dubai chocolate's a lot of fun. I don't know if have you tried it yet?
I actually have some at home because someone gave it to me. So yes, yes.
And you can unpack that. I mean, it's a trend in and of itself, but it's also a trend because it uses less chocolate than a straight chocolate bar. And chocolate right now is in short supply and also is expensive. And it delivers a lot of texture and maybe also pistachios instead of almonds. So do trends affect what I eat? I would say no, if you can believe that. They affect what I try. So I will try things that are trendy and I'll incorporate them into kind of my daily pattern if they fit. And I certainly I would say we cook from 5 or 6 different countries every week. So we're almost never cooking American food. And so to that extent, when there's more availability of authentic products from other countries, then yes, I will incorporate those. But, do I look at the trends and say, oh, there's a trend toward protein, I really need to eat more protein? No.
Well, and you have a well-established eating pattern as well, so that and already a very exploratory, I'd say, taste and palate. So you might be affecting some of the trends rather than trends affecting you. In other words, sometimes my husband says, "Oh, I just set the trends. I don't listen. The trends don't affect me." So we'll see. Quickly, I think the good thing is this was, you've given such great information on trends, and the good news is, every week we'll be hearing from Mindy with a minute trend check on some of the new trends, and especially that might be related to the particular topic. But as we wrap up, the fact is always what is top of mind. And you and I both have been involved in many different ways. You directly working with the U.S. Department of Agriculture on some of the eating patterns of previous years, and from myself, from monitoring and doing research and whatever on dietary guidelines for decades. And you and I probably could say is that there's a certain group of us, sometimes we'll call it inside the beltway and nutrition people, that get really excited every 5 years when the dietary guidelines for Americans get released. But they seldom get the headlines that they received last week. So the good news is, the average person is somewhat heard about them, talked about it. But those of us kind of inside the nutrition circle probably are a little more concerned. So this is not about, obviously, the whole section, but just a quick, love to hear what would be your take, and especially for someone listening is like, what do we need to take away from what we just heard and try to restore some balance?
I think the most important thing is to go beyond the headlines. And this administration is very headline heavy. So it's not a license to eat more meat. In fact, the protein guidance probably is closer aligned with the way people already are eating. There's a really strong message to eat real food. And I would say that's the most important thing. And don't leave your common sense don't check your common sense in at the door. Because if you take a step and think about what a sensible diet is, it may not be the most exciting thing, but it's the most likely to keep you healthy long term. So I would say, look at these guidelines, take them with what's now not as heavily bashed, a grain of salt, and think about what really makes sense beyond the headlines.
And I would add to that is that dietary guidelines have always been about real food, and it's not a new phenomenon in that reality. It's just looking at it perhaps through a little different lens. But again, it's whether it's what influences trends, nutrition, but it's looking at how do we be able to get nutrient dense foods. Real food, but real food can also be fresh, frozen, or canned, and I think that's one of the messages that maybe didn't really come through last week in some of the announcements. But the fact is, there's a variety. So, well, I think when we talk about that's definitely a headline for in the last few weeks, and we'll see more headlines as well as we continue to explore the stories around food, ag, and nutrition in Rooted and Restless. Thank you, Mindy, so much for your insight on trends and how trends affect what we eat or may not, but the future, and really how the environment also affects trends, and how the reality is that trends, how they affect the economics and the agriculture, not only in the U.S. but across the world, because after all, it's about global influence wherever we eat. So the good news is that, as I mentioned earlier, we'll continue to hear from Mindy every week on her trend check minute that you'll hear about the different subjects that we'll talk about every week, but we'll always hear from Mindy. So thanks again, Mindy, for your wonderful insight on the beginning of the year, all about food trends.
Thank you.
Stay tuned, because food always has a story, and it's not as simple as you think. Thanks for listening. Subscribe to Rooted and Restless wherever you listen to podcasts, or find us on YouTube.